I never imagined I would one day be telling this story. My name is Jackson Hale, and I'm the kind of man folks in this part of Montana know by reputation before they even meet me. I stand 6'7", way more than most men can carry, and I've been running the Hale Ranch since my father passed away. Out here, life is about grit, sunburn, and hard work from before the first light touches the hills until long after it disappears. I've always prided myself on running a tight operation and no excuses, no shortcuts, no pity. If you worked for me, you did what you were told, and you earned your keep. When my ranch hand quit unexpectedly last fall, I needed someone to step in quick. Calving season was coming, the barns needed repairs, and I couldn't handle it all alone. I posted a help wanted notice in town and at a few nearby communities. Most locals knew what working for me entailed, so the applications were few. Then, one morning, a stranger walked up my long dirt driveway with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't look like any ranch hand I'd ever hired. He was maybe 5'9", lean in a way that said desk job more than cattle wrangler, and his jeans looked brand new, without a single tear or stain. His name was Luke Turner, and he told me straight away he'd never worked on a ranch before. If he'd shown up in the middle of summer, I might have sent him packing, but desperation makes a man consider what he normally wouldn't. He explained that he lost his job at a marketing firm in Denver after the company downsized. His mother had passed a year earlier, leaving him as the sole supporter of his 17-year-old sister. He needed work, any work, and the fact that my ranch offered free lodging was more than he could hope for. I laid it out for him plain: long hours, heavy labor, minimal pay until he proved himself, and no complaining. He nodded, maybe a little too quickly, and agreed. That's how our arrangement began. The first week was rough. Luke's hands blistered from gripping the reins and hauling hay bales, and he didn't have the balance for mucking out stalls without stepping in the wrong places. He'd forget to latch gates, and once he nearly let a half-dozen cattle wander out toward the road. I had to shout his name and sprint after them before disaster struck. Each night he would drag himself back to the old bunkhouse, shoulders sagging, clothes caked in dirt, looking like a man who had fought a war and barely survived. I told myself I'd give him 1 week. If he couldn't adapt, I'd put him on the next bus to Denver. But then something happened that shifted everything. It was late one evening, the wind cutting across the open fields with the kind of cold that bites through denim and into your bones. I was walking past the bunkhouse when I noticed the door slightly ajar. Inside, Luke was sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, his face pale and lips trembling. A thin blanket was wrapped around his shoulders, but it was doing little against the chill. I stepped inside, frowning. He tried to straighten up and act like nothing was wrong, but I could see the truth. His movements were slow, his eyes glassy, and there was a faint limp in his right leg. When I pressed him about it, he admitted that he hadn't been eating much. The small weekly pay I'd given him, already less than most ranch hands' Madia, was being sent almost entirely to his sister so she could cover her school expenses and keep their apartment. He'd been living on black coffee in the mornings and a single piece of bread in the evenings, skipping meals during the day so there'd be more money to send home. The limp, he explained, was from twisting his ankle 2 days earlier while carrying buckets of feed. He hadn't told me because he didn't want me to think he couldn't handle the work. I stood there, looking at this kid who had signed up to be my servant in all but name, and realized he was killing himself to keep someone else's life together. Without another word, I bent down, lifted him into my arms as if he weighed nothing, and carried him out of the bunkhouse. He tried to protest, saying he could walk just fine, but his voice lacked any real force. I took him to the main house, straight to the guest room, and set him down on the bed. The heat from the fireplace in the corner was a world away from the icy air of the bunkhouse. I told him to rest, that from now on, he'd be eating proper meals, and that his ankle would get a few days to heal. That night, I made him a bowl of hearty beef stew from the kitchen and sat there until he finished every spoonful. I could tell he wasn't used to anyone looking after him, but he didn't push back. Afterward, I helped him into bed, pulling the thick quilt over him until his shoulders disappeared beneath it. It was the first time in my life I'd ever tucked another grown man into bed, and it wasn't something I'd planned on repeating, but I didn't realize then how much that moment would set the tone for the days ahead. The next morning, instead of sending him out to shovel manure or repair fences, I had him help me in the office. We went over feed orders, supply lists, and upcoming auctions. I learned quickly that while Luke might not have been built for physical labor, he had a sharp mind for numbers and organization. He noticed patterns in our cattle sales that I'd overlooked for years, suggesting small adjustments that could boost profits. Still, I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself, that I needed him for more than just mucking stalls. Over the following weeks, I saw a gradual change in him. The color returned to his face, his frame filled out with proper meals, and though his work in the fields was still clumsy, he pushed himself to improve. Yet no matter how much progress he made, he had a tendency to overwork. There were nights when I'd find him dozing in the barn after staying late to finish a task, or limping again because he hadn't fully healed from a strain. Each time, I'd sigh, scoop him up, and carry him back to the house, where I'd drop him gently onto the bed and tell him to get some rest. By the end of that first month, I'd stopped thinking of Luke as my help and started thinking of him as something else, though I couldn't quite define it. He still followed my instructions, but there was a quiet companionship growing between us. We'd share coffee on the porch in the early mornings, watching the first light spill over the mountains, and sometimes talk late into the night about our lives before the ranch. He told me about his sister, Emily, how she was studying to become a nurse, and how he'd promised their mother on her deathbed that he'd take care of her no matter what. I didn't tell him, but I respected that kind of loyalty more than anything. Looking back, I realized that first cold night when I carried him from the bunkhouse was the real beginning of our story. I'd taken him in thinking he was there to serve me, to make my life easier. But in a way I couldn't have predicted, I was already starting to feel a responsibility for him, one that had nothing to do with wages or chores. And though I didn't know it yet, there would come a time when I wouldn't just be carrying Luke to bed because he was exhausted. I'd be doing it because it felt wrong to let him face the darkness alone. Weeks after that first night in the guest room, the line between employer and employee had blurred so much it was barely recognizable. Luke was no longer just the kid who'd shown up desperate for work. He'd become part of the daily rhythm of the ranch. He'd wake early with me, sometimes beating me to the kitchen to start the coffee, and he'd insist on making breakfast, claiming it was the least he could do. We still worked the land together, or riding out to check the herds, repairing fences, hauling supplies, but our conversations began to carry as much weight as the tasks themselves. Luke had a quiet way of observing the world, of pointing out details I'd long since stopped noticing. He'd marvel at the way the frost painted silver edges on the pasture grass, or how the horses seemed to understand when a storm was coming hours before the first clouds rolled in. At first, I'd just grunt in response, but over time, I found myself looking forward to those small remarks. They made me see the ranch differently, less as a relentless cycle of work and more as a place full of moments worth noticing. Still, his health was a constant concern. He had a stubborn streak that made him push far beyond his limits, and it wasn't rare to find him pale and sweating by the end of a long day. More than once, I'd tell him to take a break, only to find him later, still working, as if afraid that resting would prove he wasn't cut out for ranch life. I knew better. I'd seen what he could handle mentally. He was as tough as they come, but physically, the strain took its toll. And every time his legs gave out or his body simply shut down, I'd do the same thing, lift him up, carry him inside, and tuck him into bed with a blanket pulled to his chin. The first few times, he'd protest, embarrassed by the gesture. "I'm not a kid," he'd mutter, staring at the ceiling while I made sure he was comfortable. I'd just tell him to shut up and rest. But over time, the protests faded. He learned I wasn't doing it to make him feel small, I was doing it because I wanted him safe. It was strange, realizing how natural it had become to look after him, like I'd been doing it all my life without knowing. The town noticed. Livingston, Montana, might not be as small as some ranch towns, but word still traveled fast. More than one neighbor hinted at the odd arrangement between me and Luke. A rancher as big and gruff as me, carrying some city boy into the house at night? It made for easy gossip. Some folks were cruel in the way they phrased it, but I ignored them. I'd learned long ago that people who spend their lives talking usually don't know much about living. What they didn't see was how much Luke gave back to this place. It wasn't just about his willingness to work, it was about the way he'd brought a new kind of life to the ranch. He had ideas I never would have considered, like setting up an online store to sell our beef directly to customers across the state, or offering weekend riding lessons to tourists from Bozeman. At first, I thought those ideas sounded like city nonsense, but when we tried them, they worked. By the end of winter, the ranch was making more than it had in years, and I knew exactly who to thank for that. One evening in early spring, after a day spent fixing a broken fence along the north pasture, Luke collapsed on the porch steps just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. His face was flushed, and sweat dripped from his hairline. He tried to wave me off, saying he'd just rest a minute before heading to the bunkhouse, but I didn't even let him finish. I scooped him up without asking, carried him inside, and set him on the bed. The quilt I pulled over him smelled faintly of cedar from the chest where it had been stored. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, making sure he was comfortable. His eyes were half closed, and his voice was low when he said, "You don't have to do this, Jackson." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe not. But I'm going to." It was in that quiet moment I realized that I didn't carry him to bed because he was weak or because I felt sorry for him. I did it because, somewhere along the way, taking care of him had become part of who I was. It was as natural as feeding the horses or mending a fence. Spring turned into summer, and the days grew hotter, the work heavier. Luke adapted more than I thought he could. His hands grew calloused, his back stronger, his movements more confident. But he never lost that tendency to overdo it, to work himself into the ground. And every time he did, I was there to catch him before he hit the bottom. It became almost a ritual, the long day's work, the stumble or the sway, the moment when I'd lift him up and feel his weight settle against me. I'd carry him into the house, his head sometimes resting on my shoulder, and I'd think about how strange it was that this had started as a strict arrangement between a rancher and his hired help. It wasn't strict anymore. It wasn't even really an arrangement. Luke wasn't my servant, he was my partner, in more ways than one. We split decisions about the ranch now, discussed plans for expansion, even argued sometimes like brothers might. He had a voice here, and I listened to it. Late one night in July, we sat on the porch after the rest of the ranch was asleep. The air was warm, crickets singing in the grass. Luke stared out at the fields, the moonlight turning the tall grass silver. "You know," he said quietly, "when I first came here, I thought I'd last maybe a week. I figured you'd fire me before I even got used to the smell of the barn." "Boot a broken bar you didn't." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about that first cold night, about how small he'd seemed sitting in that bunkhouse with nothing but a thin blanket and a stubborn determination to survive. "I guess I saw something in you," I finally said. "Something worth keeping." He didn't reply, but when I looked over, I saw the corner of his mouth lift in a faint smile. That night, he worked late in the barn again, and sure enough, I found him half asleep on a pile of hay. Without a word, I picked him up, carried him inside, and tucked him in. People might think it's strange a man like me carrying another grown man to bed night after night. But strength isn't just about muscle. It's about showing up for someone, over and over, even when you don't have to. It's about deciding that their well-being matters as much as your own. These days, when I carry Luke to bed, I don't think about the gossip in town or what people might say. I think about how far he's come since the day he showed up with that duffel bag on my driveway. I think about how he's not just part of the ranch now, he's part of my life. And I know, without question, that as long as he's here, I'll keep doing it. Every single night,